Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank Dr. Cano for inviting me to be part of the symposium, and also the University of Minnesota. So I am going to basically kind of cover basically the physiology behind puberty and where that originates from, or maybe perhaps as a part of the discussion where the problem might be coming from. And then I'll finish with just some of the research that we've done as a collaborative team with many people in this particular room. So as you've already heard before, sorry, I'm going to look to see, there it is. Estrus is the only marker that we have for Gilt fertility and timing first service. And so unfortunately the timing of that symptom of puberty and the symptoms are really highly variable among these young Gilts. And so as you've already heard from the previous speakers, following anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks of intensive Boar exposure, there has been over years an increased proportion of Gilts that are showing either no symptoms of estrus or either weak symptoms of estrus. And so when thinking about like what is the source of this particular problem, I guess we could speculate a lot of where this is coming from. And if it is a Gilt problem, the question would be when and where does this first occur? As the speakers already mentioned, if it's in utero, that would be maternal influence. Something's going wrong with mom. Post-natally, again, could be something going on, something feed-oriented in the milk during the grow-finish period, or something going on at selection. Is it at the ovary, the hypothalamic-pituitary axis? If it is internal to the Gilt, is it health or is it genetic related? And if it is external, is it housing related, feed management and environment? So don't really have any of the answers, but it could obviously be a combination of some of these particular factors. And what we heard from the previous speakers is it could be flow related, something that they share in common. Generally speaking, reproduction is neuroendocrine controlled. And so just this little cartoon here is basically showing that the reproductive control system originates at the hypothalamic-pituitary axis, which I've initiated or just abbreviated HPX. And this is actually controlled by a series of neurons. And these neurons release neuropeptides. These neuropeptides release FSH and LH from the pituitary into the bloodstream. And so these gonadotropins travel via the circulatory system, where they'll act at the ovary to stimulate follicular development. If everything goes right, these follicles get larger, they produce estrogen, and when there's positive feedback of estrogen, we wind up with the symptoms of estrus behavior, vulvar swelling, and ovulation, and everything goes well. But obviously something is not quite right in this particular system. And so at the hypothalamic-pituitary axis, the neurons that actually control GnRH secretion. So GnRH is one of the critical hormones that allows the gonadotropins, FSH, to be secreted. But one step upstream of these GnRH neurons are kisspeptin neurons. And these are the neurons that actually can induce GnRH release. And these particular kisspeptin neurons are also the ones that have estrogen receptors. So it's not the GnRH neurons that have the receptors, but the kisspeptin neurons that can respond to feedback. And so when everything is working properly, GnRH is released in a particular pattern that it's difficult for us to measure because it's at the level of the brain. But these patterns are more pulsing or surge-like since they're neural related. But what we do see is if we measure LH, we do see clear pulses or surges of LH that are associated with a specific type of a reproductive event. And so how GnRH is released actually affects how FSH is released in the blood and what sort of effect that actually has on reproduction. So those sorts of things has to be orchestrated properly to get reproduction well. At the level of the ovary, when these FSH and LH are released into the blood, they will act at the ovary to drive follicular development. And so briefly, what we're looking for is follicles that can respond to FSH and LH. They develop to this large ovulatory size. They produce lots of estrogen. And that's what we're looking for these fertile animals. This is what we are looking for in this first pubertal estrus. But if if we're looking for where is the source of the problem, we probably need to start back and at least looking at in utero gilt development. And so I've just highlighted a few things along the life cycle of this particular gilt before she is born. And if we look at the end of the first trimester, both the ovaries and the reproductive duct system, the uterus, the oviducts, are already forming at the end of the first trimester. And so we could ask ourselves, is there something wrong in the physical structure of these structures that would indicate something's wrong? But in addition, the neural pathways are also developing at the same time, and generation neurons actually are migrating into neural centers at this particular time. And so if there is something going wrong in utero, it could be affecting these neural pathways and the migration of these generation neurons. That could explain a lot if there is something going on. For example, I think it was mentioned staph, is that right? One of the microbes that causes meningitis, maybe there is something there. But in the second trimester, everything's basically already formed, and what we're seeing is fetal pituitary hormones, FSH and LH, can already be detected, and you can already see secondary follicles. So by this particular point in time, the reproductive structures are already formed and are functioning at that time. After birth, both the uterus and the ovaries continue to grow. And while I won't go into over all of this, what you're looking at is from birth at day 0 up to puberty around day 190 or 200 days of age. And what you're looking at simply here in the top graph is simply showing the uterus continues to grow, not only in weight but in length. And what we find here is that the uterus is actually responsive to the ovaries very, very early in life. And so at day 70 of life, the ovaries are actually active. So there's tiny follicles that are producing estrogen, and that uterus is responsive. Some research that was done removed the ovaries at days 20 to 30 of age after birth, and what they looked at is the uterus did not grow in those animals that did not have ovaries in them when compared to animals that have ovaries. So well ahead of the time that these animals are pubertal, they are responding to really, really low levels of estrogen that these tiny follicles are producing. So again, there could be something else that's going wrong. Maybe something is not working properly at that, from the ovary standpoint, and certainly not feeding back at the level of the hypothalamus. The maturity of the reproductive tract appears, at least from my opinion, appears to be a process and not a single all event. They don't all of a sudden, today they're prepubertal and tomorrow. This is seems like an event. It's an entire process that allows them to be mature. And so while the mature ovaries can actually respond really early in life, as early as day 100, as they continue to mature, day 140, 180, a greater proportion of the gilts can actually respond to FSH and LH. And in addition, ovulation rate increases. So early on at like day 100, if you give them this FSH and LH, they may only ovulate 3 or 4 follicles. That's it. All they're capable of doing. But as they get upwards of 180, 190 days of age, they can ovulate up to 16 to 18 follicles. In addition, the animals that develop large follicles, they don't always ovulate them. And that's one of the things that we've seen in the research that we've done, and some others have published as well. They can develop large follicles, but something goes wrong with the ovulatory surge mechanism. And so that's why you might see estrogen increase, but you'll never see any evidence of ovulation. In addition, in these very early animals, they will not cycle. You can get them to ovulate, but they will not cycle at a 21-day period of time. They are just not mature yet. So it's going to take them time to have that brain mature so that they can actually cycle. The hypothalamus really appears to be the key to all of this, and what you're looking at is kind of a blow-up of just the hypothalamus here. These different colors here are different neural centers. These are clusters of neurons that are responsible for different functions. And so these particular centers, at least in reproduction, are responsible. One center is responsible for biorhythms, seasonality, cyclic events, day and night, and others are responsible for sex behavior or reproduction. These neurons from these different places, these kisspeptin neurons, actually impinge on the preoptic area, which is where the generation neurons are. And that's what allows function to occur. In rodents, there are GnRH neuron clusters that are associated with just the standing response, a separate one that is responsible for just GnRH basal pulsing, a separate one that is responsible for a surge ovulatory release, and another one that is responsible for proceptive behavior. So if you're thinking that this wasn't complex, it's even more complex. There are different neural centers that are responsible for different functions, and so it's amazing we can get reproduction to occur at all. But anyway, these are not necessarily all identical and linked together. The ovaries, so when does the brain mature? Well, we already saw that the ovaries mature relatively, or can be mature quite a bit earlier, but the ovaries, the hypothalamus is actually under negative estrogen feedback control. Sorry, that should say the hypothalamus. And what you'll see is the ovaries are producing low amounts of estrogen that feed back at the hypothalamus. If you remove the ovaries, there is no negative feedback, and what you see in the white bars is LH increases. There's no negative control system. The hypothalamus or pituitary just runs at full max. But if you put estrogen back in at any time at 90 days, 150 days age, or even near puberty, you can see LH goes back down to controlled levels. But what you'll notice is that the black bars is as the animal gets older and older, it's losing sensitivity to that negative feedback. And this is the essence of brain maturation. The brain is becoming less sensitive to the negative feedbacks of estrogen, and that is the hallmark of hypothalamic-pituitary maturity in these gilts. This is what is required for all of these neural centers to function normally. As already mentioned, Boar pheromones, we're using boar exposure to induce these animals into puberty, so this is an important component of it. Much of what's known has been studied in rodents, and we know that the boar submaxillary glands produce these 19-carbon steroids, such as 5-androstenone, and boars that have these glands removed cannot advance puberty. So there can be a 30-day difference with boars with these glands and without them. So they're very sensitive. The gilts are sensitive. The pheromones are detected by the vomeronasal organ, which is a recessed cavity in the nasal passages, and it runs identical parallel with the main olfactory system. And these pheromones are detected and actually send direct signals to the hypothalamus where, guess what? They interact with kisspeptin neurons. And in rodents, these kisspeptin neurons are associated with lordosis, the standing response. So we don't have this complete data yet in the pigs, but it seems like it's a very nice story to tell as well for the pig. What are the indicators of puberty? John Paul already indicated sometimes there's no clear indicators. And that's unfortunate. We can't figure out which animals are going to cycle or not. We only get a chance to see that these animals are going to cycle just within the 5 or 6 days before they express puberty. And so what we typically see is just an estrogen increase in the 4 or 5 days before, and then an ovulatory LH surge and estrus expression. But in this particular study, they had no estrus gilts as well. And in this particular case, they also saw an estrogen increase, which means they had large follicles developing, but when they slaughtered them, there was no LH surge when they bled them, and there was no corpora lutea, which means they did develop large follicles, they had an estrogen increase, but they did not ovulate. So I think just because they have large follicles does not mean that they are mature. In addition, they also had animals that did not show any follicular development and did not show any estrogen increase as well. You might be wondering, hey, there's a group missing in here. What about the silent heat gilts? I would argue, although that's not part of this particular study, you'll see an increase in follicle size, an increase in estrogen, an LH surge, but what is missing is the standing response. So something in one of those neural centers is not functioning properly. So if we look real quickly here at what's going on in the follicular phase, we see the increase in follicles and then they ovulate. While these follicles are growing, we see an increase in estrogen in circulation. We're supposed to be seeing some symptoms associated with this: proceptive behaviors, vulvular swelling, and then as estrogen increases, we get increased GnRH pulsing, and eventually we get an LH surge, which causes ovulation. So physiologically, these sorts of steps are what we're expect and what we would look for in animals that show these normal patterns. What they see at the farm, of course, they don't get to see all what's going on inside on the ovaries. What they wind up with in those 5 or 6 days before expected estrus, they might see interest or activity, vulvular swelling, some. As it gets closer and closer, maybe more vulvular swelling, more interest, more seeking out the boar if they have that opportunity. And then in the estrus period itself, when these animals first come in, or are first in estrus per se, it's going to take them just a little while to stand. And that's because they're on the front end of this estrogen curve. So it might take them a few more minutes to stand. It might take a little bit more stimuli to get them to stand in response to the back pressure test in the boar. And sometimes the responses may be a little bit weaker. Wait half a day or wait the next day and you can get an immediate standing response just by applying back pressure. They're very, very sensitive because estrogen is highly elevated and they're really stimulated. When they're going out of heat, we see the exact opposite as well. They're starting to show mixed signals. They may take a little bit longer before they show the standing response. And this is all normal, and it's been documented before that these animals, it's not an all or none response. It's a gradual process, very similar to the estrogen patterns that they see as well. I know there's been some things mentioned about vulvular swelling, and I put up here as well. I put up just a few pictures, 0 score all the way to a 3 score, bright red, swollen. And one of the things that we've noticed years ago, of course, is that there is a dissociation between vulvular swelling and the estrus response. On the y-axis here is percent of animals in a standing estrus response. On the x-axis here is follicle size, and the lines actually are indicating a vulvular score, really highly. What you'll probably notice is it's really just large follicles that have the greatest relationship, and that you can have everything from a small, really tiny vulva to a very large vulva associated with estrus. This is a heritable trait, and over time this has been kind of lost, I think, in the selection mechanism as well. And through generations of selection, this can be reversed. But for right now, when farms need animals to breed, they breed whatever is available. But at any rate, these sorts of things have kind of fallen out, and large follicles are really just most associated with the estrus response. So just kind of a cartoon picture of what's going on. Prepubertal gilts come in, they'll ovulate, growth follicles ovulate. This is their first heat no serve. After that, they will form corporal lutea, and that could be diagnosed with progesterone. And then they will come into their second cycle 21 days later if everything's going normally, and this will be their first service. During this time, the farms are looking at predominantly behavior. They may be using other vulvular symptoms or vaginal symptoms as well. Hormones tests are available, and ultrasound can be used as well as diagnostic tools for troubleshooting. So I wanted to finish up with just simply going into some of the work that we've done with the partners that are here, and I'll acknowledge everybody at the end because there's a lot of people, as they mentioned. And this is just some of the work that we've done with Pipestone and PIC and some other groups working on what was behind the reproductive physiology for these particular animals. And so my involvement has been really only recently from January to this year, so I have not been involved with a lot of the data that they have previously. So the study objectives, there are 3 main ones: to determine if the ovaries and the hypothalamic-pituitary axis were normal. In the first one, we simply asked the question, can delayed puberty gilts with no estrus symptoms, could they respond to PG600? Could they grow large follicles, express estrus, and ovulate? The second thing that we asked is, can gilts that were showing no estrus or weak heat, and they would have been diagnosed as having corporal lutea. These would have been not silent heat. Some of them would have been silent, others would have been weak heat, but they would have had to have corporal lutea. Could they respond to prostaglandin lutealize and regress OCL, and then develop large follicles, express estrus, and ovulate on their own with their own exotic hormones. And then lastly, we did the same sort of treatments with no estrus, weak heat, and we also used positive control of estrus gilts and asked the question, could these animals show a synchronized follicular development after 18 days of matrix treatment? This is kind of just a schematic diagram of what we did. So here's the 6 to 8 weeks of prior boar exposure where they were classified at various stages of estrus, no estrus, or weak estrus. We came in after the 6-week period and did some ultrasound scanning, and blood samples were taken and sent to Missouri. And then they were assigned to either PG600, they were given lutealize if they had corporal lutea, and then depending on what estrus classification, they were put on the matrix. And so we had over 100 and something animals assigned to these particular treatments. We ultrasound scanned them. Behavioral measures were taken in here, and then all the animals were sent to slaughter for reproductive tract collection at some particular time. Just a real quick example of what we were looking at for the ultrasound pictures. The prepubertal ovary, large follicle development, and then corporal lutea, and then some of the pictures associated with those reproductive tracts at slaughter of what we were using for diagnostics. The PG600 test, I know this is tiny, so I'll just kind of go to the, cut to the chase. Most of the no estrus gilts, and that would be 80 to 100% with delayed puberty, grew large follicles within 4 days. So these animals, despite their no estrus appearance in 6 to 8 weeks, they could grow large follicles in response to PG600, FSH, and LH in a really quick period of time. There were farm differences. You're looking at farm 1, farm 2, in what their prepubertal status at the start. These farms were nearly identical, so there's no clear indication of why. But farm 1 had a much higher proportion of prepubertal animals at assignment. And post-treatment estrus class was also quite a bit different. And what you're looking up here is the proportion of gilts in farm 1 that showed no estrus or no heat symptoms, weak or strong estrus. And you can see most of them were in the no estrus category. In the second farm, the majority of the animals showed a strong estrus response. So, but some of those estrus responses were what I classified as irregular. Short duration, long duration, or interrupted estrus symptoms. In the prostaglandin test that was done at one of the farms, 60 to 80% of the animals that had shown either no heat or weak heat could regress their corporal lutea to a prostaglandin injection. They grew and ovulated their follicles on their own without exogenous hormones from us. So they had the capability to actually do it. Regardless of their previous estrus class of no heat or weak heat, 60% could show a normal estrus as determined by the farm. And so, again, there was a pretty high incidence of what we classified as irregular estrus. And I made the conclusion that the reproductive system appears to be able to function. Is it always doing that? Apparently not, but it can function with some intervention. And then the matrix test, I'm only showing one farm data because we still have other data that's coming in as well. There were variable proportions of gilts, 60 to 100%, that grew large follicles 5 days after matrix. That didn't seem to be completely related to whether they were classified as no heat, weak heat, or even a strong estrus as well. But gilts in all estrus classes could switch classes after treatment. And that means animals in a no estrus class could become a strong estrus or weak. Animals in a weak estrus could become a no. And so that's somewhat perplexing, is that they're not destined to be a weak estrus animal all their life, or at least not what we saw here. The proportion of gilts, when we went in at 210 after 6 to 8 weeks, or 6 weeks of boar exposure, and we looked at that, 80% of the animals with a weak heat classification had already cycled. However, animals with no heat classification, 40 to 50% of those had cycled. That means the other 50% at this stage We're prepubertal still. If you wait another 30 days and slaughter them or scan them, there's now becomes a difference. More of those will become cyclic. And so this is a time sensitive, if you're going to try to make an intervention of status, this is time sensitive. You can't wait till they're 260 days of age to make your decisions as well. Summary conclusions. I would say after 6 weeks or so, 80% of the weak heat gilts and 50% of the no heat gilts were cyclic. The delayed puberty gilts can grow and ovulate follicles not only to PG600 but to their own endogenous hormones. So the systems can function. Estrus appears to be highly variable not only between the affected farms, but between cycles, and gilts can switch categories from one cycle to the other. Hypothalamic hormone release is not occurring in prepubertal gilts. So no matter how much Boar exposure and positive stress is put on them, they are not responding for some particular reason. And post-treatment, estrus behavior is absent or poor in 60% of the females. What could this mean? Maybe during embryo development to maturity, there is some sort of a disruptor to the neural cluster development or function. It could also, whatever is happening here, could be reducing sensitivity to Boar stimuli along that neural pathway that we talked about, and disrupting estrogen feedback, resulting in poor HPX hormone release and even the behavioral response. And it appears that the HPX is unable to respond normally unless there seems to be some sort of a hormonal intervention involved on our part. And what could possibly be done in the short term? I guess I came up with maybe try to limit bad stress or at least evaluate. I would say check for evidence of crowding, as Dr. Foxcroft maybe had mentioned earlier, or multiple mixes. I am at least aware that there's positive effects of some stress, there's good stress, bad stress. Multiple mixes allows these gilts to fight, and that can have detrimental consequences. One mix maybe not so bad, but multiple mixes as these animals get delayed could have detrimental effects. I know you've all probably heard ad nauseum improving Boar stimulation, but the farms have obviously moved to twice daily, maybe physical Boar exposure area, so check on that. I also am a big believer in interval Boar exposure versus continuous or adjacent exposure, and that is to avoid habituation and refractory behavior. So I just have seen more positive effects of interval introduction of the Boar rather than continuous exposure. If there was some way for us to select high libido Boars, that could be a good one. Maybe we need a test out there to allow us to pick up high levels of androgen. And then I also think in the short term, if we're trying to deal with these difficult gilts, maybe we encourage our technicians to apply more stimuli, give them more time to elicit these particular symptoms. Apply more back pressure, side rubbing, flank rubbing, and rather, these animals are difficult, let's try to spend a little bit more time. Lots of cooperators here, Pipestone, PIC, Carthage, University of Missouri, Iowa State. Thanks to all of the people that invited me to be part of this. So, thank you.